Today I'm going to show you how I take GetGood drums from sounding like this to this. So this is my song Deviation 2070, and my goal with this was to write like a southern rock influenced prog song. So I thought this would be a good one to take a look at for sample drums because it's not a super heavy metal thing, and I was going for a drum sound that was a little bit more natural and more organic. So I want to take a look at all of the sort of processing I did on this, and I'll go through this fairly quickly. And by the way, I'm not a professional mixer by any stretch of the imagination, but I have some tricks and tips that I've come up with over the last couple of years that I think are fairly useful. So as far as the kit goes, I have essentially just like the stock kit here. I believe the only thing I've changed is the snare drum. Yeah, I have a snare drum on this Ludwig. I liked it for this particular song. And this is Modern and Massive, by the way, and this is the GetGood sample sample library that I pretty much always use. Yeah, and then I did some mixing within the plugin as well, just kind of balancing some levels out. Not a lot of bleed happening from the snare because, I mean, essentially you just try to eliminate that if you're dealing with acoustic drums. So the fact that you're using samples means you can just get rid of that right off the bat and have a little bit of turbo on all of these. And I don't want to take that too high because that's some pre-processing essentially. But a little bit of it makes the hits, I think, sound a little bit stronger overall. And then as far as the routing goes in Contact, this can be a little bit tricky, and I'll probably actually need to do some more adjustments to it. But I'm doing this slightly different than how I used to do it. So I have 5 stereo tracks and then 6 mono tracks. So if I go to here, the mono tracks are overhead, room, snare room, hi-hat, and ride. Actually, no, those are the stereo tracks. Stereo tracks are overhead, room, snare room, hi-hat, and ride. And then all my shells are in mono, so kick, snare top, snare bottom, tom 1, 2, and 3. Now, I used to process the toms all together, so I had them come out of Contact as one channel, but I like to be able to process each tom a little bit differently because they all have different tones to them. So it's just for the sake of EQing the fundamental pitch of each tom. I like to have them separate so I can process them separately. And then as far as the routing of the drums themselves, I have overhead, room, hi-hat, and ride going to a cymbal bus here. The shells and the snare room are going to a shell bus. And then both of those are going to the main drum bus. And then that's going out to the master bus. And then I have some parallel effects. So I have parallel compression, which I'll talk about later on. And I have 2 reverbs for the snare. So that's how the routing's going. So I'm just going to turn all of this processing off. And we'll get to work. Now, most of the stuff is happening on the individual channels, but I am doing some stuff in the buses. So I'll start with that. Here's how the drums just sound with only the master bus processing. And I won't cover this too much, but I do a little bit of processing on the buses just to kind of beef it up overall. A little bit of a push at 3K or 300 hertz roughly in the low end. Tiny boost at 1K. And some of the stuff I kind of did after the fact. Once I had the whole mix, I realized, hey, I want these particular frequencies up a little bit. A little boost at 3K and a tiny boost at 8K. So just little boosts here and there. And this is the SSL E channel from Brainworks. And this is an awesome plugin. It sounds really good. I used to use the Waves SSL channel, but I think I like this one quite a bit more. It sounds a lot better to me. It has this awesome total harmonic distortion right here. And that sounds really cool. A little bit of bus compression on the master bus, and this isn't doing much at all, like a couple dB at the most. Really slow attack, fast release, ratio of 2:1, which I would never go over for a master bus. Then this Meg EQ, which we'll see again, I think, in this mix later. I don't use this too often, but here in this case I have this air band kind of set to give a little bit of life on the high end, and then a tiny bit of boost in this sub, which adds some nice sub lower frequencies to it. A little bit more EQ. I probably did this after the fact, thinking that it needs a few things here and there. True Iron, which is one of my favorite saturation plugins. This is very subtle as far as what it's doing. I have some other saturation plugins that do more, but this one is really nice on buses and overall kind of mix details because it's pretty transparent. And then I have Flatline, which is a limiter. And now I don't mix into a limiter, but I have this here just so I can boost the volume up and hear what the mix will sound like once it is up to mastered volume. So I usually do the mastering parts separately, which I'm even worse at mastering than I'm mixing, but it is nice to be able to hear it a little bit louder because things do change within the mix. So I always put that at the end. I don't mix into it, but I turn it on just so I can listen to what it sounds like with some limiting. So that's the master bus. Let me play the drums with all of that off. And then here I'll turn the master processing on. It's actually doing a decent amount, kind of really dealing with some overall frequencies and giving a little bit of a boost. So let's take a look at the main drum bus. All I have here is another instance of this True Iron, and I just felt it needed it after the fact just to kind of boost up the frequencies a little bit. Saturation. Now I do most of my bus processing within the shell bus and the cymbal bus because I don't do the same kind of processing to cymbals and shells, right? I want it to be a little bit different, so most of that's going to happen within each of these buses. So let's take a look at the shells and see what that's doing. So we have a high pass and low pass. A little bit of compression. Couple dB at the most. Fast attack, a little bit slower release. Ratio of 1.5, so not huge. Tiny bit of reverb, and this isn't something I always do, but I felt it needed a little bit more space. It's incredibly subtle. And then another instance of saturation. This is the Black Box Hg2, which I absolutely love from Plugin Alliance. This is a more aggressive saturation than the True Iron. Sounds really nice though. It's actually doing a decent amount. So if I turn all those off and on, so that's what's happening there. And cymbal bus. EQing out all of the lower frequencies that would have any of the shells in it. So a little bit of a high boost there. Tiny bit of compression on this as well. I mean, literally just barely touching it. And then this saturation knob, which is another saturation plugin, but this is a free one, and it's really great. It just has one knob, and I used to use this all the time before I had some ones that I paid for. But so if you're looking for something free, this is a great one. Actually doing a decent amount there, and then a little more instance of reverb. Once again, I don't always do this, but I thought it worked in this particular case. So all off. And on. All right, so here's all the drums with just the bus processing. Nothing. All right, that brought everything back in. Okay, cool. So let's take a look at the individual channels. So first up, we got kick. I always start with the kick. Here's the kick on its own. Really a nice sound, but I kind of want to scoop out some of the mids and give it a little bit more life on the top and bottom. So this first EQ we got our high pass and low pass, and a little bit of boost towards the fundamental tone, and then I just notched out a couple of frequencies I didn't like. Like kind of ringing frequency. Really subtle. And then we got some compression. Once again, just like a dB at the most, maybe 2 dB. And what you'll notice is we have already multiple stages of compression. So we have compression for the kick here on the individual channel. There's on the shell bus, and then as well as on the master bus. So we're already dealing with 3 levels of compression. And that's kind of one thing I've learned as I've been mixing. It is like, it's not one thing that's going to make a big difference. It's a bunch of little things that add up to the overall product. So if I do different stages of compression and different stages of saturation, different stages of EQ, then the sum of all those little parts add to a lot more than if I tried to just throw on like one, plug-in at the very end and try to change everything. And that's what I used to do when I first was mixing, because you don't know what you're doing. It's like you throw on one plug-in, it sounds really good, and you just like crank it. But if you subtly kind of work your way towards a good sound with a bunch of steps, that usually works a little bit better. So next we have another instance of the SSL. This is going to be doing quite a bit. Big boost on the high end at 7K, about 4.5 dB. And if I was doing metal, I'd probably do this even more, get a really clicky sound. Right? Something like that. But because of the style of music that this is, I wanted to kind of keep it a little bit less aggressive on the high end. A little bit of a scoop at 2.4. This is kind of just a boxy frequency. Actually, that's kind of like a papery. So a little cut there. A cut at about 800 hertz. That's like your boxy sound. And then a tiny boost on the fundamental, another boost. Not much at all. And then I have this harmonic distortion up a little bit that kind of adds some life to it. Another instance of the black box, and this is going to be doing quite a bit. Really adds a ton of aggression to it. I really like that on the kick. Then we have Jst Clip, which is a transient designer. And this one is really great. It's super easy to use, one knob, fairly inexpensive, and you're going to see this on a number of things on the kit. But this is really just kind of accenting that initial transient. So the black box and the clip are doing a ton if I turn those off. Really bringing the kick drum to life. Another instance of EQ, and I think this was just to bring down a couple frequencies a little bit that I didn't like and boost up the high end. Really subtle. These are like less than a dB. And then another instance of this Meg EQ, and I'm only using the sub frequency here, and this is just going to kind of boost the low end. I probably brought that on afterwards because I thought it needed a little bit more on the low end. So if I turn all the plugins off for the kick, and all of them on, just kind of get rid of some of the boxiness and let it cut through, give it a little bit more attack and life. Now let's talk about the parallel compression. And this is something that all the drums are going into, but mostly the shells, actually really mostly the snare, but it also is happening with the kick and toms as well, and like a tiny bit on the cymbals. But the parallel compression is compression that runs in parallel with the drums. And what this is going to be doing is adding some life, just some body and thickness to the drum sound overall. I'm just going to solo the parallel compression here. And let's look at what's going on. So we have this bus compressor, slowest attack, fastest release, and a ratio of 10. And look how much compression this is doing. Like 15 dB when the snare is hitting. And what happens is you have this slow attack. So the compressor hits it slow and then it releases really quickly. So you get this bloom of sound after the initial transient. So combined with the direct mics, this really brings life to the end of the hit and kind of opens everything up. And then this is something that you'll blend to taste. So depending on how much I need it or how much I think it adds to a particular mix, it can bring it in and out. And I'll do that in a second. Next we have Decapitator, which is another awesome saturation plugin. This one is much more aggressive. And I don't actually have it pumped too hard here, but off. Just kind of making this a little bit more aggressive. And then another instance of the Jst Clip as well. So if we go back to the kick drum, let me bring in that parallel compression. Here's it with it off and on. All right. And that's happening mostly with the snare. So as we move on to the snare, I'll kind of talk about that once we get in there. So next we have the snare top, and I process the top and bottom of the snare differently. So I don't have them running to a snare bus. Really the snare bottom I'm going to use for a lot of high-end like sizzle. So I don't want to process the two of them the same. I know a lot of people run snares into a bus, but I don't know. I just never have done that. So the snare with nothing on sounds like this. This is snare top. First up, we have notching out some frequencies I didn't like. And this is a lot more than I would normally do. Normally I'd make like 2 or 3 notches, but these are all pretty subtle. I just thought that certain frequencies were ringing out to my ear more than I liked. Especially this one. Right, those sort of ringing frequencies. So I turn it off. Just kind of dealing with a couple of those nasty ringing frequencies. Next we have the main snare EQ. A little boost in the top end, cutting out a little bit of the mid, and keeping the fundamental note a little bit higher. That's just tightening up the sound. High pass to get rid of the low. Another instance of compression. Slower attack with a fast release. Because I don't want to mess up that initial transient of the snare drum. So only a couple dB there. Then another instance of Decapitator, which I love on snare drums, and you can get really aggressive with this, but I've got it at about 3. Really makes that snare drum pop through, and that combined with another instance of the clip, Jst Clip, is really going to make the snare pop out. That and the parallel compression. So if I take the parallel compression out, so that's doing a lot on the snare, especially the snare top. So another thing with the snare is I have 2 reverbs, and I'm sending the snare to both these reverbs. I have a gate reverb and a plate reverb. So I'll start with the gate reverb. And this is by Valhalla, Vintage Verb, probably my favorite reverb. Here's with it off. And on. That's a shorter reverb. Then you have the main reverb, which is the plate reverb. Same plugin, but we have different mode and a longer decay. That sounds like this. So if I turn the reverbs off, notice when I turn them on, the whole thing just comes to life. Reverb is super important on the snare, and I don't use reverb a ton in mixes overall, but It's really important on snare. That's the one place where it's really important to have a good reverb setup. So those two in combination, I think, really bring the snare to life. So with none of the processing on that snare top, and I'll flip it all on. So obviously making a massive difference. Snare bottom, and this is going into the same effects, parallel compression and reverbs as the top. So here's the snare bottom. First thing I do is cut out all the low frequencies and boost some highs. My goal with the snare bottom is it to be like a high sizzling sound that I can add into the snare top to give it a little bit more of that sort of high-end ring. A little bit of compression. This is just barely touching, obviously. Then we have Decapitator, and this is super cranked on here. This is going to make a massive difference. That's really bringing that out. And then another instance of clip. So here's the snare and top and bottom together, and I'll just bring in the bottom as we go. So that's where I had it, 10 dB. So I just bring it into taste just like with the parallel compression. So one other thing that's happening with the snare is the Snare Room. And I don't think I have much no, I actually have no processing going on at this at all. But all I'm doing is once again bringing this into taste. And that's actually doing quite a bit. It's doing kind of what the parallel compression is doing and adding some life to it. I would normally maybe do some more processing on it, but not in this particular case. Cool. So there's the snare. So kick and snare together. All right, now on to the toms. And I'm just going to solo all the toms at once. And I essentially do the same processing on each of the toms, just kind of some slight differences depending on the frequency of each tom. So let's find a tom, like a part with some tom fills here. All right. So right off the bat, these toms are pretty boomy, so I kind of want to deal with that. So I've got a gate, and this is essentially the same setting on all of these. That's just to kind of cut. And that might seem really aggressive to have them cut so quickly, but in the context of the mix, it's good. I don't want those toms ringing out. Next, we got EQ. So on tom 1, the EQ is such. I'm just kind of boosting the high end, dealing with some frequencies I don't like in the mids. And we're going to have the same sort of deal on tom 2. Just some different frequencies for that tom, and then also for tom 3. On tom 3, I'm cutting out a lot more of the low end because it's the floor tom, you know, it's much more boomy. So here's all the EQ on all of these, and off. Just giving them a little bit more attack. Then we have a little bit of compression on each of these. Once again, this isn't doing a ton. Couple dB, slow attack, fast release. And then we have Saturn, and this is doing the most. And what I'm doing here is just having it distort the high frequencies. And this is a trick I picked up from Nolly of GetGood Drums, obviously. And you just distort the upper end of the tom, like the high sort of attack part of it, pretty heavily with Saturn, because Saturn can saturate different frequency ranges, which is awesome. So if we add this in, this is doing a ton. It really gives you this sort of super attack heavy toms, which I like. So if I turn Saturn off, then bring it back in, That's doing a ton. So let's solo all the shells here on this fill. Alright, there you go. So there's the shells. Let's take a look at the overheads. There's not too much happening on the overheads or the cymbals overall, but we've got our overheads. Let's go back to the beginning. Once again, cutting out the low end. A little boost on the upper part. And then we've got some compression. This isn't doing much. These are those off. Just trying to isolate those cymbals a little bit more. We have the room. Another instance of cutting out the low end. So room and overhead together. And that's the bulk of the snare sound, or of the cymbal sound. The snare room I already talked about, so we have hi-hat, and the hi-hat is so low in the mix you can barely even hear it, and I don't even have any processing on it. I usually don't like the direct hi-hat mic too much, but I have it there just in case I want to bring some of that in. But in this case, it's essentially inaudible. Let's go to a section that has ride, because I have the ride as its own. It's fairly low in the mix, and I actually don't have any sort of processing happening on it at all, but I just kind of bring that in with the other ones. So here's all of the cymbals together on this section. So let's choose a louder section. Alright, so that's all the drums. Let's solo the drums again in full. Alright, let's take a look at the very end where it's super loud. Alright, so there's a quick look at how I mix Modern and Massive by GetGood Drums. I highly recommend any GetGood Drums products. I think they sound absolutely incredible. Really affordable and professional sounding, and really my drum mixes have never sounded better as far as using sample drums than when I'm using GetGood Drums. So hopefully you got something out of this, and I will probably do this again in a couple years once I improve more and have some new techniques to show. But this is where I'm at right now, circa July, August 2021. So if you enjoyed this lesson, of course, subscribe, hit the bell notification, like, comment, share, all that good stuff. And as always, stay proggy.